I'm John Allen Gay, the executive director of the John Quincy Adams Society. We're here tonight to talk about the rise of China and whether it will lead to war, in particular with the United States. Implicitly, this is a question of power transition, of the relative rise of one state next to another. And we've got a great conversation queued up for you tonight on that. But before we get started, let me just drop in the chat for everybody to see links to two upcoming events that we have. One will be on November 10th. It'll be a debate on this new wave of Middle Eastern diplomacy. There's been a great conversation going on about why it is that so many Middle Eastern states that don't get along very well are talking to each other all of a sudden. For example, the recent talks involving Iran and Saudi Arabia in Baghdad. There has been a case made by Trita Parsi, one of our debaters, and several others, that this is a product of the U.S. Drawdown in the region, that these states are no longer able to hold on to their grudges as tightly against one another and have to learn to live with one another since they can't count on Uncle Sam to back them up. Taking the other position is Thanasis Kambanis, who will be arguing that there are local factors driving this and that we shouldn't be terribly optimistic about this new wave of diplomacy. So that's Wednesday, November 10th. Then on December 8th, we have an event on the choice to go to war in Iraq in 2003 with Mike Mazar of the RAND Corporation, who wrote a really impressive history of this that had a lot of access to the decision makers at the time. So he's able to both give some of the inside dirt on how that decision was made and to talk about potential relevance for U.S. national security thinking today. But let's go ahead and pivot to our main event. We've got Patrick Fox from our Syracuse University chapter, one of my almas mater. I'm very excited to be co-hosting an event with that chapter. Patrick, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick. I'm the president of JQAS's Syracuse chapter, where we meet every week to discuss different areas in foreign policy. I'm especially excited about this event because we recently talked about China just 2 weeks ago. And we're excited to be hosting Dr. Shifrinson. Joshua Shifrinson is the author of Rising Titans, Falling Giants, How Great Powers Exploit Power Shifts. He's an associate professor of international relations at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, where his research focuses on international relations theory and international security, great power politics, U.S. foreign policy, grand strategy, and diplomatic history. His PhD is from MIT.
Great. So over to me. Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone else in the John Quincy Adams Society for having me in. I also want to preface my remarks with an apology. If you hear a dog barking quite loudly in the background, it is not, in fact, the dog of war, but the dog of hunger who is staring out the window at the squirrels. She will do her best to be quiet, but please bear with me. But I'm here today to talk about the dogs of war and the prospect of a US-China conflagration, right, in the context of the possibility that China's rise will lead to war. I'm going to try to speak for 20, maybe 30 minutes, and then turn the floor over to Q&A. But in the time I have, I really want to try to push back on this idea that China's rise inevitably will lead to a US-China conflagration. Right? This is an idea that has gained in prominence in IR theory. Of course, as far back as Thucydides, we had people who talk about how the rise of one state in relative terms and the relative decline of another could precipitate conflict, either because one side attacks the other directly or another side gets pulled in because of conflicting interests or conflicting allies. But it's an idea that has gained particular traction over the last 10, 15 years in the US Academy, with people like Graham Allison talking about the Thucydides trap and how when there's a power shift that occurs, one state rises in power, another one falls, conflict almost inevitably occurs. And unless you think this is purely an academic theory, this is an idea that has gained lots of traction in the policy space. Of course, starting as far back as the Clinton administration, there were concerns that China's rise may upset regional politics in East Asia and maybe set the preconditions for some conflict, tensions, and bad conditions for the United States. But since the late Obama administration, then accelerating under the Trump and Biden administrations, there's a real sense that the US and China may be on a collision course, and that China may either overstep what the US sees as its red lines and somehow trigger a US response. There's a reciprocal concern that people are increasingly voicing that the United States may overstep one of China's red lines, particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan or some of the island disputes, and perhaps trigger a crisis. And then, of course, there are concerns that that the United States' allies may end up entangling it, dragging it into a war at a time and a place or in a way that the United States might otherwise wish to avoid. And so there's this growing consensus, growing concern in both policy and intellectual debates that China's rise is setting the world on a path to war, right? Well, I don't know. I don't know if you want me to burst this bubble or not, but I'm here to offer some reasons to be a little more cautious on this concern, or at least a little more suspicious of this concern. The possibility exists that China's rise will not lead to war. And let me walk you through this, because this is an idea that I tackled in my first book. I've written about some of the specifics of the US-China relationship since. So let me try to walk through the theory and then try to turn to some of the specifics of the US-China context. So as I noted, there's a real concern out there that one state's rise will trigger a conflict because of the declining power of another state. Yet when we look historically, these sorts of power shifts really don't always lead to war, right? Famously, for example, the United States and Great Britain did not go to war with each other, even as the United States arose. But more dramatically, the Soviet Union and Britain didn't go to war, even as Soviet power rose in Europe and British power declined in Europe and beyond. And further afield, there are situations like between Austria-Hungary and later on Germany, where even after they tilted with one another and fought each other for the future of Germany, the future of what became unified Germany in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, after that initial crisis, Austria and Germany had great relations. In fact, Germany went to war for the sake of Austria, even as Austrian power declined in the run-up to World War I. So there are some really notable examples where a power shift didn't seem to trigger on its own a conflict between a rising state and a declining state. And so my question is why? What can we use to explain this? Well, in my book, I try to emphasize that a lot of the calculation between a rising state and a declining state, whether the relationship tilts towards a competitive relationship that might lead to war, or a more cooperative, conciliatory relationship that might sustain some kind of peace, hinges on two factors, both from the declining state's perspective. Both from the rising state's perspective. The first is whether the rising state, looking at a declining state, thinks to itself, you know what? That declining state has some strategic value to me. In other words, the rising state says to itself, I can use that declining state instrumentally, perhaps, but I can still use that declining state to keep other competitors in check, other states that I'm worried about in check. And to do that, a declining state has to have some particular characteristics. Not all declining states are so empowered, right? First of all, there have to be other great powers out there in the world that a rising state wants the declining state's help. So there needs to be at least some kind of multipolar environment out there. Second, a declining state has to be geographically positioned in a location and physically located in an area that if a rising state comes to a declining state's assistance, chooses to cooperate with a declining state, that the declining state can actually play a useful role in checking the rising state's other competitors. You know, it doesn't help during the Cold War. If the US wanted to check the Soviet Union, it didn't matter if Brazil was a rising state. It's pretty far from Europe. But it mattered a lot if Germany or Japan or China at the time were close to the Soviet Union. Location matters a lot in this context. And then finally, there has to be some plausible domestic coalition, domestic grouping that is interested in cooperating with the rising state, a domestic grouping in the declining state that's interested in cooperating with a rising state. So a rising state isn't just looking at this monolithic antagonist that doesn't have any interest in cooperating, if at all, for an olive branch, there has to be some plausible coalition that says, you know what, I'm willing to play ball with this rising state if the rising state is willing to play ball with me. So when you have a multipolar environment, when you're in a decent geographic position, and when there's some plausible basis for cooperation amongst the declining state's domestic elites, a rising state is poised to look at a declining state and say, you know, despite the changing distribution of power, I'm willing to maybe cooperate with you. I'm willing to see if I can use you in a benevolent kind of way, purely to keep other great powers in check at a very minimal level. There could be other reasons for cooperation, but that's the minimal one. And of course, if some or all of those conditions are absent, if there isn't a multipolar environment, if there isn't a domestic basis for cooperation with a rising state, or if a declining state's in a really bad geographic area, far away from the rising state's other competitors, declining states likely to have low strategic value, and there's going to be a little more friction, competition between a rising and declining state, at least plausibly. But even then, even after a rising state has assessed the strategic value of the declining state, the degree to which it competes with or cooperates with a declining state is going to hinge heavily on a declining state's own military choices. And this is really important because even in that scenario where I mentioned, where a declining state has low strategic value to a rising state, all hope is not lost. It doesn't mean that a rising state is simply going to go for the jugular immediately, lop off the declining state's head, push into the dustbin of history, and walk away. In fact, there's a lot more that goes into this. So let me build this out for half a second. When a declining state has high strategic value, has some meaningful strategic value to a rising state, the rising state still needs to ask the question, well, do I really need to help the declining state today? Can I wait till tomorrow? And more importantly, if I cooperate with the declining state, am I going to be snookered and betrayed? Am I going to be somehow cheated or attacked in kind, or they're going to partner with one of those other states I wanted them to deal with? Why should I move today? Well, the declining state's military posture plays a really big role in this first decision. When a declining state has what I call a robust military, a military that's able to kind of service a declining state's security needs, keep other great powers in check, and protect itself, then a rising state that even wants to help a declining state is likely to say to itself, you know what? I'll be nice to them, but I'm not going to really align with them. I'm not going to really deepen my relationship with them. After all, under those conditions, there's no incentive to aid a declining state in the near term. And as importantly, if a rising state comes to the aid of a declining state that can still take care of itself, that ups the odds of the declining state doing something reckless and entangling the rising state in a costly foreign adventure, or even turning around, betraying it and stabbing it in the back. So instead, it's only when a declining state is militarily weak, looks unable to handle other threats out there in the world, that a rising state seeking to keep that declining state around as a capable check on the great powers and other threats out there will move in and assist a declining state to a full degree. This calculation, though, changes in those low strategic value situations, those situations where a declining state doesn't do much for a rising state, keeping other threats in check. Under these situations, a rising state might want to prey upon, might want to challenge, might want to exploit a declining state, setting the international community on a path for perhaps conflict and war. But here, a declining state's military posture is actually a win for a declining state. That is, a declining state that kind of pumps resources into the military, that builds itself up, can make it so unappealing for a rising state to get after a declining state that the declining state can check a rising state's predatory instincts. And instead, it's only in situations where that declining state is militarily weak, in the situation where a rising state sees low strategic value in the declining state, that we're likely to see a rising state decide to kind of push the declining state around, really tilt with it, and really set the world on this path for conflict and war. So what I'm portraying then is a world where even a state, even a rising state that might want to get after a declining state, might want to exploit a declining state, conditions that would logically lead us to be worried about international war, are actually fairly infrequent. It's only when there are no other great powers around, that a declining state can help with, when a declining state only is uninterested in cooperating with a rising state, is in a bad neighborhood, and is militarily weak, that a rising state is likely to get after the declining state and lead the world towards conflict. In all other scenarios, when a declining state has some strategic value and or has a pretty decent military, under all those conditions, a declining state can check a rising state's predatory instincts and at least keep the degree of antagonism at bay, limit the likelihood of a rising state trying to get after a declining state. Now, I could talk to you about how this framework applies across history. I've done a lot of work on the end of the Cold War showing that even as the United States was tilting with the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union was declining and the United States was experiencing a relative rise, even under those situations, the Soviet Union was able to keep the United States in check for a very long period of time by virtue of the absurdly large Soviet military apparatus, was able to keep the United States in check by virtue of America's fears of what would happen if the United States, as a rising state, overstepped its boundaries and ended up triggering a conflagration with the Soviet Union. So even in that situation where the United States wanted to compete with, exploit, prey upon the Soviet Union, Soviet military strength helped keep the United States in check. And it was only when the Soviet military apparatus really collapsed that the United States moved in to exploit Soviet weaknesses, encouraging the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, reunifying Germany within NATO. And then, of course, after the Cold War, expanding the NATO alliance into the former areas of the Warsaw Pact up to the former Soviet Union itself. So that's just a flavor, though. I'm happy to speak more to that in Q&A. But let me talk about why this framework actually suggests some degree of optimism for the U.S.-Chinese relationship today. I'm going to talk about this in two different ways. First, I'm going to talk about it in the context where the U.S. may actually offer China some strategic value. That China, despite the current tensions in the U.S.-China relationship, may, when the chips are down, actually see value in having, if not a super friendly relationship with the United States, at least a semi-cooperative one. Why might this be the case? Well, this goes back to that strategic value thing I was talking about a little while ago. If you sit in Beijing today, you're looking at a world where, you're a rising state. You have an economy that's booming. You have a growing military apparatus. You have growing international influence. But to borrow from Shakespeare, all is not well in the state of Denmark at the same time, right? This is still a situation. I realize I bungled that Shakespeare quote, but we're going to keep going. This is still a situation where China has to worry about domestic unrest at home, but as importantly, has a nuclear armed Russia to the north, of whose loyalty China can't be confident about, growing frictions with India, an increasingly antagonistic relationship with Japan. And although none of these countries has China's net capabilities on the whole, if you're sitting in Beijing, the world isn't bipolar. It's a multipolar world. There are other countries that China has to worry about profoundly. And the United States, being offshore on the one hand, quite powerful at the same time, and also having relatively lower degrees of friction, territorial disputes, historical disputes, political disputes with China than these other countries, may just be useful in helping to keep these other countries in check. By in check, I don't mean a U.S.-Chinese alliance to balance Japan or balance Russia. I simply mean a U.S.-Chinese relationship where the U.S. can restrain a reckless Japan or restrain some degree Indian behavior going forward. I'll leave the Russian relationship alone for now. That's a conversation for Q&A. And so it's plausible in this framework I'm laying out. Plausible. We don't know what's going on in the minds of Chinese decision makers, that over time, China, or maybe even today, China will recognize that it has some reason to keep the United States around and maintain a semi-cooperative relationship with the United States, purely for instrumental reasons, purely for managing these geopolitical tensions that Beijing still needs to face. That's one scenario. And by the way, if that scenario I just painted is correct, the US would do well to actually walk back its current degree of antagonism towards China. right? Because this is a situation where the US suggesting that there are some policymakers open to a cooperative relationship with China will pay dividends by signaling to the Chinese establishment, a Chinese olive branch will not be thrown back by the United States. So there are things the US could and should do under this first scenario to kind of catalyze, to facilitate greater degrees of US-Chinese cooperation. But what about that second scenario I mentioned, right? The situation where maybe, just maybe, the policymakers sitting in Beijing don't see India, don't see Japan, don't see Russia as competitors. Maybe sitting in Beijing, policymakers actually believe this is more or less a bipolar world. And the United States, by virtue of it being bipolarity, has very low strategic value to Beijing, that the United States is really only going to be a competitor to Beijing. Well, as I mentioned, in this scenario where the US would have low strategic value, that's a scenario where China may indeed want to compete with and challenge the United States. And that situation where you would have a Thucydides trap would be quite worrisome. But here a second element kicks into play, which is that the United States retains a massive military apparatus, conventionally and nuclear. In the nuclear world, the United States has the ability certainly to destroy China several times over. And it may even have the ability to conduct what some people call a glorious first nuclear strike and decapitate and eliminate the Chinese nuclear arsenal, which may check Chinese ambitions. And at the conventional level, although the balance is changing, there's no doubt, let me repeat that, there almost seems to be no doubt that although the US may not be able to win in a contest close to Chinese shores, may not be able to prevent China from conquering Taiwan, for example, in a longer term contest for, say, the future of the Asian Pacific region, the United States can severely bloody China's nose, and China has no guarantee it could win. And particularly because China lacks a guarantee it could win in a conventional operation alone. If China actually thinks time is on its side, it has every interest to buy time still and let the US just keep going about its business while Chinese strength grows. Long term, this would be a problem for the United States. But at least in the near term, for now, China should be deterred. And so what all this means is that under almost any plausible scenario and several different frameworks, the United States and China, although they're on a competitive and increasingly tense and fraught relationship, the odds of China's rise leading to a war by virtue of China antagonizing the United States just seems very low on strategic grounds alone. The two sides could certainly blunder into a contest due to miscalculation. But if anything, I would be more concerned that the United States will inadvertently overstep China's red lines and trigger a contest than I would be in the other way around. So to the question posed, will China's rise lead to war? In contrast to several prominent scholars and much of the policymaking establishment, I'm a little more optimistic. China's rise need not automatically lead to war. And there are some good reasons to think that the United States has options to handle its security and prevent a conflict from breaking out for a very long period of time. And with that, let me step back and take some questions.
Excellent. Well, I'll exercise my privilege as host to ask the first question. There was a recent article in Foreign Affairs by John Mearsheimer about the rise of China that's gotten a lot of attention. His argument, if I could boil it down, was that the United States was exceptionally foolish to accommodate the rise of China over the last 30 years or so. Basically, that once the Cold War ended, we really should have started checking China's rise, particularly through not signing a lot of trade deals, not having such a broadly friendly policy toward them at the strategic level. What do you make of that argument?
John is right on many issues, and but also I offer a slightly different reframe of what the U.S. got wrong with the U.S.-China relationship. After the Cold War, the United States' first and primary focus was on maintaining the unipolar era, right? It embraced a grand strategy called primacy. John Mearsheimer, who I count as a mentor and a friend, would agree with that. Like, he would say, you want to be the unipole if you can do it. The problem with the U.S.-China relationship is how the US chose to go about seeking primacy. It banked on this idea of engagement in economic cooperation as assuaging points of friction, reducing points of friction, perhaps transforming China into what former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Robert Zellick called responsible stakeholder. Now that is an odd strategy, right? You're doing this very fundamentally realpolitik thing called maintain your great power dominance, using fundamentally liberal, that is non-realpolitik means. So I think the US mistake was not choosing, it was its inability to choose. It could have maintained primacy. I think that would have been a foolish strategy. I think it would have been a self-defeating strategy. But I could see the US doing so. Or it could have embraced a liberal approach and accepted that primacy was going to end. It was the marriage between a realpolitik outcome and a liberal means that has caused the problems in the US-Chinese relationship. And to John's more specific point as to what the US did wrong with China, the US benefited by China being the low-cost workshop of the world, right? The US consumers benefited, I should say. Many industries were harmed, many US workers were harmed. So I want to be very careful about how I describe this. US consumers benefited by the flood of low-cost goods coming from China. So I think encouraging China to become the workshop of the world on some low-tech issues, eminently reasonable. But as China moved up the economic food chain, and as China gained access to more and more Western technologies, that's about when the US should have been pulling the brakes back a little bit. So John's argument isn't totally wrong. I would just offer a slightly different interpretation of what the US did right and did poorly.
Awesome. So another question we have from someone in the audience is, considering that America and China's economies work in a form of symbiosis where they depend on each other, how does that affect the idea of conflict between the two nations?
You know, it's a really good question, right? And this is an idea that has a long pedigree in international relations. I'm sure many of you have read Norman Angell, The Grand Illusion, the idea being that economic interdependence before the First World War would preclude or make it exceedingly costly for different states involved to go to war. And I think it's very true that economic interdependence raises the threshold for conflict, right? The more that states are dependent upon one another economically, and the more costly it will be to consumers, to voters, to citizens to go about their daily lives, economically costly to go about their daily lives. The harder it is for states to construct military apparatus because their trade networks are intertwined. You know, it raises the threshold of what will generate conflict. And absolutely, I think that logic holds. But it doesn't prevent conflict, right? And in fact, as we've seen today, past a certain point, economic interdependence actually generates concerns that one's sovereignty, that one's security can be impeded by another country that has leverage over your own country, that has leverage over your own economy. So while I take the point that the US and Chinese economies are symbiotically linked, at least for now, there's also there are two other problems. It doesn't eliminate the sources of political and military tension between states. So conflict can still erupt, as we saw in the First World War. And at the same time, it generates a new source of vulnerability, this fear of being exploited by the person or the country, that has economic leverage with it. And so the symbiotic relationship actually carries the seeds in a very large way of its own destruction. As we see today, there is a desire to pull back, to find alternate trade networks and supply networks. And that trend is going to continue, I expect, as tensions between the US and China mount, partly because of this very economic symbiosis that's mentioned.
So I've got a question that came in from my colleague, Julie Thompson-Gomez, who I know worked with you as a research assistant as this book was in the works. Was asking about how do rising powers, what shapes a rising powers' perceptions of the strength of the relatively declining powers military? You know, when China looks at the United States, how are they going to assess how capable our military is? And maybe to expand on that question a little bit, how do you assess the current balance and the trajectory of the balance? You know, because we've seen a lot of proposals in Washington for example, a major naval buildup, For some people, will sometimes link nuclear modernization to China. The modernization of the nuclear arsenal. Are we looking good for the purposes of your argument? Because everybody will talk about, for instance, China is launching like 20 ships for every 5 that we launch. And so they're definitely making a big buildup. But how does that shake out in terms of the actual calculus?
No, it's a great series of questions. I'm glad, Julian, you have raised them. I see Patrick shaking his head because it's a commonsensical question, right? Isn't it obvious that perceptions matter more than the objective reality? I'm a little more skeptical that perceptions diverge heavily from reality in this context. In other words, when you're talking about doing something very dangerous to the world, like rolling the iron dice and going to war, and if you're a rising state, perhaps triggering a conflict that you've worked very hard to avoid during your rise, and perhaps engaging in a conflict that can stop your rise going forward, policymakers have a real incentive to sit down and go, okay, can I win this thing? Yes or no? Not, do I think I have a chance? Not, how many ships will I lose? It's kind of a very blunt question. Can I win this thing and still emerge with my trajectory intact? And so if you're sitting in Beijing today and the military balance is as I described, the US spends about 3 times as much as China on military affairs. The US has a legacy of using high-tech military hardware, has technological superiority in many key domains vis-a-vis the PRC. Even if Beijing is off by a little bit, even if Beijing is launching 20 ships a day, it requires a policymaker in Beijing to say, I think the US looks feckless and weak, and I can do this thing and escape unscathed, for China to roll the iron dice, for any country to roll the iron dice in this way. And so you take all that and you come to the conclusion, I think, that says, you know what? Perceptions track reality pretty closely in this context. Rising states have to really get it as close to right as possible. There can always be deviations. Nothing is 100%. Oftentimes we don't know until conflict begins what the real distribution of power looks like. But in terms of shaping perceptions, it's darn close to what military hardware and military technology and military posture suggest about the nature of a conflict. It doesn't deviate too much.
We have a question from John Mueller. Is there any evidence that beyond the Taiwan issue, China has any expansionary desires?
Hi, John. No. Not to be glib. No, there's very little evidence that I can tell that China has expansionist desires. And in fact, you can even turn the story around. China obviously seeks to prevent Taiwan from declaring independence, but it's had that desire for a very long period of time. And without being, I don't think this is to be an apologist for the communist government. But one thing I've been struck by is how quiet China has been in the face of some increasingly provocative moves that, if I were in Beijing, would worry me about the US or its allies trying to encourage Taiwan to go independent, or at least the US walking back some of its commitment to a one China policy, not the one China policy, a one China policy. So I say all this because it's not clear that it's actually not clear to me that China has expansionist goals even vis-a-vis Taiwan. And it's not clear that China has significant expansionist goals much beyond Taiwan, unless you count the island disputes, which strike me as just kind of a vestige of old school imperialist concerns, right? This is symbolic for China, but it's not territorial aggrandizement the way the Soviets probably wanted to own most of Western Europe, or the way the United States decided to own most of North America. This is a much more limited kind of territorial ambition, if it even exists.
Got a question from Chance Chancellor. And by the way, folks, feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or to upvote other folks' questions. Chance asks, if America and China were to fight, would it be primarily a naval engagement decided by naval power, like perhaps the Russo-Japanese War? Or would this be World War III, nuclear use, all of that? What does this potential conflict look like?
It's a huge question. I'm glad someone's asking it. In my more optimistic moments, which become fewer and fewer every day, I like to say that involves mostly an air and naval campaign, probably somewhere in the Western Pacific. But I'm actually not convinced about this because the way in which the US likes to fight, blinding adversaries outside of hostilities, limiting their ability to retaliate, and reducing the risk of nuclear use, that implies the US may be inclined to attack portions of the Chinese homeland. And because, as people like Vipin Narang and Caitlin Talmadge have emphasized, because China co-locates or may co-locate both its conventional and its nuclear forces, at least on when it comes to missiles, the risk of inadvertent escalation in the US-Chinese context, that is inadvertent nuclear escalation, you really can't discount that. And to turn the issue around, because China, if a conflict breaks out, would almost certainly want to change the distribution of power in the Western Pacific by limiting the flow of US forces into the region coming from places like North America and Europe, China would have an incentive to strike things, be it by cyber operations or other options, on or near the US homeland, generating an incentive for the United States to respond. So I don't think we can assume that a contest would be limited to naval and air campaigns alone. I think there are reasons to hope that if a US-Chinese attack on homeland territories were limited primarily to military bases, that we wouldn't be talking about all-out escalation to nuclear war. But neither are we talking about a limited contest in that environment either. We're talking about something pretty gnarly. You know, great power war in the nuclear age should scare everyone, even if it's a quote unquote a small war. And by the way, the U.S. Waged a 20-year war in Afghanistan for 3,500 people killed in the World Trade Center bombings. You know, an aircraft carrier carries 6,000 U.S. service members. So I don't think we can assume that a military contest alone doesn't carry its own risk of spirals and long-term escalation.
I actually have a question myself. I'm curious, given some recent turbulence with Chinese financial systems and even leadership in the Xi Jinping era, do you think that internal Chinese politics might play a role in their future decisions, or more so, in what way might internal politics play a role in their future decisions regarding the rising, falling power dynamics?
I'm sorry, Patrick, could you just repeat the question? I lost you for half a second.
Oh, totally. Sorry. How might China's internal policies, given sort of Xi Jinping's cult of personality and sort of financial turbulence, how might that affect the decisions that China makes in regards to the U.S. and rising power dynamics?
Well, so it's a good question. You've raised two different types of internal dynamics in China. So let me take them in sequence. First of all, economically, right? A lot of my conversation is premised on the idea that China is in fact the rising state and the US is in relative decline. But if China's growth peters out, stops, slows, or collapses, and it becomes something of a declining state, there are two different hypotheses there. One is that China would kind of go, well, the same structural conditions that I identified a little while ago of China being deterred from acting against the United States because of the military balance and China's other competitors, those same dynamics may hold. But at the same time, there is a literature in political science that has a little bit of what happens to a dream deferred flavor to things, right? The idea being that if your rise stymies out and you still have ambitions for the future, is now the time that you have to go because your position is going to get worse in the future. And I think people like Hal Brands and Michael Beckley are working along these lines. We hear concerns that this is the decade where China's growth will slow. And so therefore, this is the decade that the US should be most concerned over Chinese aggrandizement. I find those sorts of arguments less compelling because if China isn't willing to act as its strength is growing because of structural conditions, why, if China is going to decline, would it roll the iron dice, perhaps dig itself into an even deeper hole? But nevertheless, that concern is out there. So economically, in terms of Chinese internal politics, I think a slowdown or internal unrest that really stops China's ascent is something to be worried about, something to be cautious about, but should be manageable. Point number one. But then you also asked a question about Xi Jinping and the nature of the Chinese leadership situation, right? And that's where things get a little dicier. It's when you have, by many accounts, Xi has and is continuing to consolidate power under his own rule. He's kind of eliminated constraints on the kind of the consensual decision-making apparatus that was built up following the Mao era in China, all of which would increase the both his own domain of action, his ability to set an agenda on his own, but also the possibility that he himself could miscalculate and not be checked. And this is, again, a real concern. I guess I would come at it, though, from the perspective of we have lots of evidence. We, the United States and other countries in the world, have seen many types of leaders at the helm of great powers, right? We've seen people like Stalin, seen people like Khrushchev, people like Richard Nixon, people like Ronald Reagan. We've seen variation in the nature of different leaders and different great powers. And the nice thing about great power politics, and I say that nice thing in quotation marks, the acceptable thing about great power politics, the comforting thing about great power politics, especially in the nuclear age, is that when both sides are heavily armed and their commitments are reasonably clear, and there's a prospect of nuclear annihilation if they screw up the calculation, that tends to focus the mind of almost any leader. And so in a way, even though Xi may have domestic reasons of his own or personal reasons of his own for wanting to tilt with the United States, to challenge the United States, or miscalculate in the future, there's a limit to how far he can go before the idea of nuclear annihilation and ruling over the smoldering ruins of Beijing at best may check his personal ambitions. So again, on that score, I'm still a little more comforted than not.
So another question that we have is from Christian Andreoli, who asks about the fact that a lot of Americans, some 89% in one recent poll suggest that China is either an enemy or a competitor, which Christian asserts implies that we're kind of expecting a conflict, but are unsure what it might be about. What do you think a possible source of conflict might be? What's like, for instance, a red line that you think would lead to China choosing to go to war with the United States choosing to go to war with China, such as cyber attacks or an attack on Taiwan, anything like that?
Mm-hmm. I think I'll offer one for the United States and maybe 1.5 for China. For the United States, I think it's very simple. I think it is a Chinese military campaign against Taiwan. And I'll broaden that to also include American allies in and around East Asia, particularly Japan, South Korea. But my main concern is Taiwan. I think an outright American attack on Taiwan, an outright Chinese attack on Taiwan, would generate American fears over its future credibility in East Asia, would be seen as the lodestone of the U.S. defensive perimeter, rightly or wrongly, I would add, in East Asia, and would almost certainly cause the American policymaking establishment, which has committed itself to norms against territorial aggrandizement, right, stopping other countries from changing borders by force, which has committed itself to seeking a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan-China standoff, which has also increasingly staked what it sees as its credibility to its fidelity to partners and allies in and around East Asia, of which it is including Taiwan increasingly in this calculation. So all of this says to me that a Chinese attack on Taiwan, or even something that is labeled an attack on Taiwan, say a offshore fight that the U.S. blames or that is attributed to China and a Chinese provocation that escalates, I think that could very well trigger American involvement for these political reasons that I've alluded to. For China, of course, Taiwan is the obvious red line, but I think Taiwan is a manifestation of a bigger phenomenon, actually, which the U.S. should be concerned. For China, it's the United States mucking about in what seem to be Chinese internal affairs, right? Taiwan, of course, is seen as part of that, But it's not just, and I use that term in quotation marks, not just Taiwan. It's also the Uyghur issue. It's the future of Hong Kong. And if we could imagine it, a situation where there's another wave of protests against the Beijing government, akin to the Tiananmen Square situation, and the US gets involved, could all trigger Chinese nationalist concerns on one level. It would also raise questions over Western imperialism, the legacy of that. And of course, it would also challenge China's own claims to sovereignty. And China, of course, has been in the forefront over the last many years in seeking to promote an international order where sovereignty and states' rights to govern themselves internally as they see fit is at the crux of international relations. So under any of those situations, of which Taiwan is a prominent but not the only manifestation, I could see the US crossing China's red lines and a conflagration resulting. I do also want to use this opportunity, though, to make one comment about public opinion polling, because it's an important point in the US-China contest. Public opinions have shown that US attitudes towards China have been hard. It's beyond the shadow of a doubt true. One thing we don't yet have a sense of, though, is how intensely Americans have that preference, right? In other words, do they regard China as an enemy, and do they say, and I'm willing to fight and die for this privilege? Or is it just, I think China's an enemy? And I draw that distinction out because unless there's a real salience to the issue and a real desire to sacrifice for the sake of fighting China, for treating China as an enemy, public opinion may be less dispositive in terms of how likely the US and China are to end up in a contest, end up in a war going forward. I'm always reminded of the Bob Dylan with God on our side at these times, right? He has this wonderful line, we killed the Germans, now we're all friends, which is a glib comment on Dylan's part, but I think gets to a truth here, which is that public opinion often follows international imperatives rather than the other way around. And so we shouldn't assume public opinion polling is dispositive in shaping the US-China relationship or any great power relationship.
We have a question from Juan Montes. What are your thoughts on the professors of America's strategy to increase their presence or to increase our presence in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China with things like the AUKUS alliance and giving weapons to Taiwan?
So a couple of things here. Number one, in case you can't tell, I am deeply worried about the U.S. Mucking about with Chinese nationalism and Chinese sovereignty concerns and triggering a contest that way. So in that sense, I'm opposed to the U.S. giving weapons to Taiwan beyond what are purely required for defense. And I know there's a difficulty in defining a purely defensive weapon, but we could imagine things that would primarily be useful for stopping an attack on a country rather than abetting possible offensive action. But AUKUS is something else, right? We're asking this question of what are the options for the U.S. to increase its presence in and around East Asia? And I'm glad someone asked this question. For most of the last decade, actually a little bit more than a decade, the U.S. has been committed to projecting and building of its own military forces in East Asia, right? And not just any kind of military forces that are really designed to take an offensive fight close to China's backyard, if not in China's backyard, right? We're talking about things like aircraft carriers. We're talking about things like short-range fighter planes, things that really can't play defense because they're not really optimized well for it. In contrast, and so in that sense, I think the U.S. pivot to East Asia and its buildup in East Asia has been problematic, especially given U.S. military doctrine and its preference for blinding adversaries, striking first, so on and so forth. However, if the U.S. is going to try to build up in the Indo-Pacific region, I think there are 2 points to keep in mind. First of all, trying to improve the ability of key actors, key territories in East Asia to stand up and defend themselves and hold out in the face of a Chinese attack, to be porcupines, in other words, ought to be a cardinal American goal. A few years ago, it was very trendy to discuss Chinese anti-access and area denial and its ability to keep the United States at bay. The United States should be looking to arm countries in the region to do their own A2AD, anti-access area denial, and keep Chinese aggrandizement at bay and limit China's options for gaining either a victory or at least a victory cheaply. Point number one. This also says that the U.S. should be doing things to improve the ability of regional actors to balance China on their own. And in that sense, the AUKUS deal in selling submarines to Australia and encouraging technology sharing is actually a pretty good thing for the United States, because as long as the United States itself is not projecting forces and it's not on the firing line in a literal or metaphorical sense, and it's Australia balancing, this is a fine situation. And so in a way, more AUKUS style deals that give countries the resources to, or that facilitate countries having the resources to be porcupines and keep Chinese aggrandizement in check, to limit China's ability to stage an attack or win quickly, that ought to be the focus of American efforts going forward.
Got a question from one of our attendees about some of the dissension within China, particularly among the ethnic minority populations in China's West. Is that something that should be encouraging that? Should that be a tool in the U.S. toolbox in a potential competition with China? And I think more broadly, should the United States see a change of regime in China as desirable or as something that we should encourage?
Right. Both are key questions, though they're slightly different. So let me take the human rights issue and the movements in China's West, and then juxtapose that with the regime change in China. When it comes to the human rights issue in Western China and the state of the Uyghurs and other minority groups in China, the U.S. needs to decide whether it's interested in human rights or undercutting China's stability. And let's recognize that these two issues do not intersect, right? If the U.S. cares about the rights of China's minorities, it should not be encouraging these actors to try to be tools in competing with China, because then they're identified with an adversary external to the state, and we're likely to see further human rights abuses. This is a well-known phenomenon in social science. It turns out that countries are the most brutal towards civilians and victimize civilians when those civilians are seen as potential enemy agents. And so if the US wants to use the Uyghurs to destabilize the Chinese regime, that's something the US can choose to do, but recognize that you're likely putting Uyghur rights further on the line. Conversely, if we think that the human rights of the Uyghurs and alleviating their conditions, their living conditions, should be a focus of American policy, and that's a perfectly valid position. I'm not coming out for or against that in this time, but it's a perfectly valid position. Then we ought to look at the conditions under which external actors like the United States can improve the treatment of civilians in foreign countries. And oddly enough, we have some evidence from history that quiet diplomacy and not talking about it in public is actually a solution, because it helps the country that is being asked to change policy to save face. For example, during the Cold War, the United States desperately wanted to allow Soviet Jews to immigrate from the Soviet Union. And it was a focal point of US diplomacy, conversations with Soviet leaders under the Nixon, Ford, Carter administrations, and thousands upon thousands of Soviet Jews left the country. Critically, though, Nixon, Ford, and Carter didn't really publicize the issue. Whereas when Ronald Reagan came into office and made the future of Soviet Jewry a cardinal point of his policy and publicly shamed the Soviets about their treatment of the Jewish population, immigration from the Soviet Union fell to the hundreds, if not dozens per year. So this is a situation where publicly decrying a human rights issue actually makes things harder to deal with if you're interested in progress on human rights. So bottom line, the US wants to improve the state of human rights for some of Chinese citizens. It has to maybe choose different tools to get there. And if it's not interested in improving human rights, and it really wants to use unrest in China to challenge the strength of the communist government, that's fine. But that's going to cause massive problems, or likely to cause massive problems for the people on the firing line. Point number one. And then, John, you also asked whether regime change should be a focal point of American policy. As a realist, I think it doesn't really matter. By which I mean, obviously, if China were a democracy, many of its people would be better. It might be normatively better, but the U.S. would have tensions with China irrespective. And insofar as regime change is likely to be a fraught process whereby the US is trying to destabilize the Chinese government and China might respond in kind, and there could be shadow conspiracies left, right, and center, or at least rumors of shadow conspiracies, this would be a situation that could really undermine mutual confidence in the other and take the brakes off of any US-China contest. And so I'd be very, very concerned as to how that process would play out. Meaning, not only am I ambivalent over the possible outcome, I don't think it matters for international security whether China is a democracy or not. But the process of even getting to Chinese democracy, to borrow from Guns N' Roses, would be a terrible, terrible state of affairs, or could be a terrible state of affairs.
So we have a question from Chance Kanzler asking about whether China's one-child policy will stunt China's growth due to issues with manpower. But more broadly, do you think that China's rise will continue unhindered, or if they have major obstacles ahead?
This is becoming a trendy topic of conversation, this broader idea of China's internal limitations, either due to the one-child policy, due to economic unrest, due to Xi's choices, environmental degradation, you name it. These are ideas that are on the table. It seems possible to me that China may be headed for a period of slowing growth, maybe heading for a period of greater friction, domestic problems, all sorts of internal turmoil. But notice, I'm not saying that China's growth will stop. China's growth is estimated to be about 7 to 8% per year now. That's about double the US rate. So even if China slows its growth rate, even if there are periodic moments of unrest, number one, we're looking at a China that may very well be able to still outpace the US in relative terms over time. Two, China has 1.3 billion people, a continental-sized country, continental-sized economy. A slowing birth rate, a falling birth rate still leaves a pretty impressive great power competitor out there. It may not be as ascendant, but it's still pretty impressive and may even find other ways of being creative as a competitor. So I guess what I'm saying is that I expect China's growth to continue, perhaps slow, but to continue. And just because China faces massive potential problems doesn't mean that it's doomed to fall apart or to stop rising. In fact, we've had predictions that China was doomed to stop rising for the last 30 years. And, I'm a Luddite. I tend to think that history can be used to inform the contemporary world. And if China overcame the end of the Cold War, the Tiananmen protests, the various economic crises of the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, all while suffering from population problems, domestic unrest of its own, so on and so forth, maybe this time will be different, but maybe it won't.
All right. Well, that's about all the time we have. Thank you very much, Dr. Shifrinson, for taking the time to speak to our audience. Thank you to Patrick and our Syracuse University chapter, Go Orange, for co-hosting this with us. Everybody, as you saw, I'll drop the links in the chat again. We've got a couple of events coming up, a debate on the new wave of Middle Eastern diplomacy, a conversation with one of the preeminent historians of the Iraq War on the choice to go to war there, which I think will be particularly interesting in light of Colin Powell's recent passing, to discuss his legacy in light of that. But thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.